Lauren. Welcome to our first of a four-part series for civic engagement from the National Community Action Partnership. My name is Lindsay Marsh. I am a senior associate and my project is census engagement, although now I'm doing civic engagement. We are thrilled today to have Allison Maloof and Caroline Kelly from CAPLAW joining us today, and Deborah Weinstein from the Coalition on Human Needs will be joining us as well to talk about the things that our agencies can do to thread the needle between CSBG and C3 status. I'm also clearly joined by Lauren Martin from the partnership and Ryan Gelman, who is our Senior Associate for Public Policy. With that, I'm going to show you all our agenda, and then I'm going to turn it over to CAPLAW and let them take it away.
Great. Lauren, I'm happy, Lindsay and Lauren, got a lot of L's today. Happy to be here. This is Allison Maloof. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of CAPLAW, and I'm really happy to have with me today Caroline Kelly. She is a staff attorney at CAPLAW, and we're happy to be here and talk to you about the ways in which community action agencies participate in civic engagement activities. In particular, our focus, of course, is on the rules that govern the ways in which you would do so. So with that, I'm going to punt it over to Caroline, and she's going to start us off, and then pump back to me and back to Caroline to keep you guys engaged and excited about this topic. Take it away, Caroline.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you everyone for being here. So Allison and I are going to go over today. What we're going to do is we're going to help you understand the universe of applicable laws that you may come into contact with as you engage in the various civic engagement initiatives that the partnership and the Coalition for Human Needs are helping us, brainstorm about. So what we're going to start from, we're going to basically lay out an analysis that we would go through as lawyers to think about the various types of laws that may apply to a given civic engagement scenario. And you can go to the next slide, Lindsay. One helpful way to think about these questions as they come up in your civic engagement work is this a question of organizational activity or individual activity? And so identifying which of these two aspects the particular question you have relates to can be very helpful. On an organizational level, CAAs and Head Start grantees and other 501c3 organizations are subject to strict requirements about what they can and cannot do when it comes to engaging in the political process. They're obviously subject to tax exempt rules, they're subject to funding source rules, and other administrative guidance related to federal grants. But on the other hand, their employees, who are each obviously individuals, have the ability to engage in certain certain aspects of civic life on their own time and outside of work, and those rights are protected by the employees have those rights to do so outside of work and on their own time. And most employees enjoy the same rights to participate in the political process as other citizens who don't work for CAAs. You can go to the next slide. So the basic rule, the first rule we're going to talk about comes from the tax code. You have all likely heard this rule before. As a for nonprofit CAAs, not public CAAs, the tax code prohibits 501c3 tax exempt charities from engaging in what's called political campaign activity in support of or in opposition to candidates for public office. And there are pretty severe violations for, pretty severe penalties for violating this particular provision, a violation can result in the revocation of an organization's tax-exempt status. And there are also taxes that can be imposed by the IRS on a nonprofit that engages in political campaign activity. The tax can be on the organization for a certain percentage of the illegal political expenditure, or the IRS can even go after individual people or managers who authorized the expenditure while knowing that it would be an impermissible political campaign activity violation. You can go to the next slide. So over time, the political campaign activity ban has been made clearer and clearer, how it would apply to certain particular circumstances in various rulings issued by the IRS. But in 2007, the IRS issued a really helpful revenue ruling called 2007-41. And this revenue ruling, which is basically just an administrative ruling that is binding on 501c3 nonprofits, this ruling laid out 21 different factual scenarios involving everything that's listed on this slide, basically. And the ruling itself goes through each activity, or each scenario rather, and identifies whether the tax-exempt organization in each scenario violated the prohibition on intervening in a political campaign. And so something that we do at CAPLAW often is go back to that memo and see if there is a factual scenario laid out in that memo that closely mimics the given scenario that we are thinking about as applicable to a CAA, and think through the different factors that the IRS has laid out to guide us in determining whether there's been an impermissible campaign intervention. And the two, obviously, that we're going to focus on today are voter education, which is under the IRS rules is generally permissible if it's conducted in a nonpartisan manner. You can't target certain groups based on their political opinion and only educate them about the issues. And you can't, as we're going to see, you can't tell, as a 501c3, you can't tell an individual who to vote for. But there's very clear guidance on permissible ways to do voter education. And also when it comes to voter registration, it's also this activity is also permissible if conducted in a nonpartisan manner. You could, and the IRS memo contains an example of how, if you set up a booth at the state fair where citizens can register to vote, and you're only giving the name of your organization and information about an upcoming election and voter registration forms, allowing voters to register for either party and not not pressuring them to select a certain party affiliation, then there's a good probability that you wouldn't be considered to be intervening in a political campaign by conducting that activity, again, as long as it's conducted in a nonpartisan manner. So I'm going to hand it over to Allison, who's going to get into some of the grant rules about political activity and civic engagement more broadly. And then we're going to walk through a hypothetical fact pattern so you guys can see a little bit more clearly how this plays out in day-to-day CAA life. So go ahead, Allison.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. So before we just switch to the next slide, I just want to emphasize sort of a key takeaway with respect to the 501c3 tax-exempt rules. I think it's important for everyone to remember that when we're talking about these rules, we're really focused on what activity are you engaged in that is nonpartisan versus what activity are you engaged in that is partisan. That's really where the IRS kind of draws the line. So as a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, you actually have quite a bit of flexibility from that perspective to engage in different types of civic activities And the general rule is, though the IRS revenue ruling that Caroline was talking about really goes through a lot of specific questions that can help you ensure that the way in which you're conducting that activity is in a nonpartisan manner. But the main takeaway is that as long as you're doing so, you're conducting an activity in an unbiased manner, you're not trying to influence the election, trying to sway somebody to vote one way or the other, then you can engage in that activity as a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. So if we go to the next slide. So what is different about community action agencies that kind of adds a layer onto our uniqueness and what some would define as our or describe as our complexity is the fact that as community action agencies, we receive a host of federal funding. And you know, the key piece of that federal funding being the Community Service Block Grant, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, and sort of the specific language in that statute and that act that kind of speaks to these types of activities that are laid out in the IRS Revenue Ruling, the nonpartisan activities as well as partisan activities. But with respect to just generally, as many of us know on this call, that as a recipient of federal funding, we have to comply with different federal laws on how we use and manage that money. And one of the key pieces of legislation, or really key rules, is the uniform guidance. And it's the Office of Management owned the uniform guidance. And there is a section in the uniform guidance that lays out sort of specific items of cost and basically describes how you can or cannot use your federal money to pay for those costs, or whether you can and cannot use your federal money to pay for those costs. So this is where we start getting into sort of the level of complexity. So you can do the activity if it's nonpartisan, but how do you pay for that activity that you can do? So one way that you cannot pay for it, if it is a partisan activity, is to use your federal funds to give to a political campaign, to donate to a political action committee, to a PAC, to contribute to political parties. So this seems pretty much understandable, because as a 501c3, you can't engage in these activities anyway. You cannot engage in what would be considered biased activities. And you can't use your federal money to try to influence the outcome of an election. So is in line with what the IRS has said. And what's always important to remember, and what's not necessarily on this slide, is that there's an overarching consideration with respect to any use of federal money that is laid out in the uniform guidance. And that overarching sort of requirement is that you will use that federal money to further the grant purposes, and you'll use it in a reasonable, allowable, and allocable way. So the furtherance of those grant purposes means that you always have to take a step back. So even though you may be able to engage in some nonpartisan activity because your IRS status, your 501c3 status allows you to do so, can you use any source of funding that you have, federal or non-federal, to support that activity? And so what we're going to talk about now on the next slide is that sort of premise with respect to our CSBG funds. So as you'll see, this slide lays out some very specific language that is in the federal CSBG Act. And this language basically establishes that you that any sort of CA program, so any program that's supported by CSBG funds, cannot be carried out in such a way that that program is identified with. And so this is a key piece to this prohibition, this identification language. So that CSBG funded program cannot be carried out in a way that it is identified with. Next slide, please. Any partisan or non-partisan political activity. And then it goes on further to sort of describe a little bit of what those types of activities might be: transportation to the polls and any voter registration activity. So what this basically means is that you cannot use your CSBG funds or a program that's funded by CSBG cannot be used in a way that would identify that use, that CSBG funded use, with any kind of partisan or nonpartisan political activity. So the identification language makes this prohibition seem somewhat broad, and there's never been a clear understanding from the federal level as to exactly how that would be interpreted or applied. And so oftentimes when community action agencies call us and they want to engage in things like nonpartisan voter registration activity, which Caroline established you clearly can do as a 501c3 organization, they want to know, well, can we do this as a recipient of CSBG funds? And I think the answer to that question is yes, just try to do it in a way that your CSBG funds will not be associated with, identified with that activity. So an example of that could be sort of the best case scenario would be if you have a facility that is not paid for with CSBG funds, it's a food bank, the individuals that work there aren't paid for with CSBG funds, and you want to conduct a voter education drive out of that, or a get out the vote drive out of that food bank. You likely could. You'd have to look at the other sources of funding that support that food bank and make sure there are no restrictions in there. And if there is other federal funding, that it's okay that that federal funding is supporting that activity. But in general, you don't have this overarching CSBG prohibition that would affect that activity within that facility. So on the next slide, you'll see that there was an information memorandum that was issued by the Office of Community Services sort of many moons ago now, in 2004, that just sort of re-emphasized this not identified language. Other than that, the information memorandum is frankly not that useful in helping to kind of understand what compliance means with respect to CSBG funds. So what's interesting is on the next slide where there's language from the Head Start Act. So the Head Start Act actually has almost identical language in it and to the CSBG Act, except for sort of two key pieces. One is the Head Start Act makes clear that that they're looking at activity that is funded by Head Start money. So there's none of this identification language in there. In other words, you cannot use Head Start funded staff, facilities, resources to engage in partisan or nonpartisan political activity. So there's still that sort of broad overreach, but it's very well defined. You just can't fund that activity with Head Start money or use Head Start funded resources. You can't drive people to the polls. But then we come to another key difference on the next slide with respect to Head Start funds, which is very useful. And that key difference is that the Head Start Act specifically has a carve out in it, which says that a Head Start grantee can allow a nonpartisan group to come onto its Head Start site during working hours to conduct nonpartisan voter registration activities. So that's a very important carve out that supports community action agencies who receive Head Start funding, supports their engagement in civic activities like the ones that Debbie's going to talk about more later on today, and the ones that are listed in the IRS Revenue Ruling that Caroline addressed earlier on our call or on this webinar. So then there's one other key piece that really gets a lot of people going, and that's on the next slide. That is a part of the CSBG Act and also a part of the Head Start Act. And that's called the Hatch Act. And the Hatch Act has become more and more well known because in recent years it's actually been mentioned in the news, which is kind of interesting, maybe for lawyer geeks, kind of exciting. But But in general, there's really no reason that a nonprofit, a 501c3, and really a federally funded organization should really ever have to worry about the Hatch Act, except for those recipients of CSBG and Head Start funds. These are the only two sources of federal funding that incorporate the Hatch Act by reference. It doesn't apply to unpaid board members, and we're going to talk through exactly how the Hatch Act applies to your organization. But we are unique in many ways as community action agencies, and this is just another one of those ways that we have to kind of, or that we are different. So on the next slide, we have here sort of a graphic sort of hopefully visual to help you understand kind of how the Hatch Act applies. And so it is slightly different for a nonprofit community action agency than it is for a public community action agency. So under the Hatch Act, you basically kind of have two types of employees that could be subject to a Hatch Act. And you'll see on the left side, I think it's everyone's left, I get kind of confused sometimes with left and right. But on the side of the screen where it says first type of employee, you have two boxes there. So basically, an employee who is spending more than half of his or her time employed by your community action agency / Head Start organization, or receives more than half of their salary from the organization, and works in connection with CSBG or Head Start activities, is hatched in two very specific ways. And when we say hatched, they mean their activities are restricted in two very specific ways. One is they cannot use their official authority to influence an election. So you as the CSBG director cannot go to a CSBG program specialist and try to influence them to vote in a particular way in an election. And you might say, well, I can't do that anyway because we're a 501c3 tax exempt organization. You already told me I can't do that. Well, the difference between the Hatch Act and sort of the normal requirements is the Hatch Act goes one step further. And once you're hatched during all times of your life while you are while you fall within the, I guess, for lack of a better word, eligibility requirements to be hatched. So basically, you're hatched in and outside of work, that the restrictions follow you. So while you're outside of work, you have to be thoughtful and cognizant about using your official authority to influence an election. You also cannot solicit contributions for a political campaign from other employees who are hatched. Now, the second type of hatched employee is one that is a little bit easier to manage and deal with. And this was a change in the Hatch Act, in the Hatch Act as it applies to community action agencies and state and local governments. And that change basically said that the employee who has to be 100% paid out of Head Start, CSBG, and/or Head Start and CSBG in order to be prohibited from running as a candidate in a partisan political election. So what this means is if you have an employee who's 99% paid out of CSBG funding, and they come to you and they say, I'd like to run in a partisan political election for a state representative or whatever the election might be, then they are permitted under the Hatch Act to do so. The other two restrictions still apply to them if they were, and likely they would if they were hatched under the second type of employee restriction, then they will be hatched as the first type of employee as well. So it's important to understand that the restrictions, all apply once you hit that sort of higher threshold of being 100% paid. What's also important to remember is that just because the Hatch Act allows for sort of greater flexibility in this area, it's really up to the organization to determine what level of comfort they have with respect to employees' involvement in the political process. So on the next slide, oh, sorry, I still have one piece of this slide, which, oh no, you can go back, you can press the button again. Yeah, one more time. There we go. I forgot about public CAAs. I'm sorry, public CAAs. Just to be clear, with respect to public CAAs, it's really anybody at the public CAA who works in connection with activity financed by any federal grants or loans. The restrictions are basically the same. The 100% analysis with respect to running in a partisan election is the same. So then on the next slide, so as I mentioned, the Hatch Act restrictions follow you inside and outside of work. And this slide just kind of goes a little further to emphasize that they apply even when you're on unpaid leave or you're on some kind of paid leave. So you always have to remember that the Hatch Act is sort of with you as long as you meet the Hatch Act the Hatch Act requirements to be subject to it. And then on the next slide, we sort of want to try to emphasize that even though you may be subject to the Hatch Act, there's plenty of things that you can do as a Hatch employee on your own time. So what can you do? Well, you can definitely be a candidate in a nonpartisan election. The Hatch Act doesn't prohibit you from doing that. And as we already mentioned, you could be a candidate in a partisan election as long as your salary isn't 100% paid out of CSBG or Head Start. You can vote as you choose. You can express your own political opinions as much as you want. You can participate in political campaigns and parties. You just want to be cognizant of not using your official titles that you have at the community action agency, which you shouldn't do anyway as a 501c3 tax exempt employee. You're trying to influence the election because you wouldn't want that activity to be attributed to your 501c3 because that could cause issues for your 501c3. So these are sort of prohibitions that you need to be aware of anyway as a 501c3 tax exempt employee. And potentially if you were a leader of your organization, you might come more into contact or play with this. So with that, we have a hypothetical. I don't know if it makes sense to jump right into the hypothetical or maybe try to look at some. I see there's some questions in the chat box that came in, and I'm happy to try to. So
yeah, let's start with some questions.
Okay. So I see here someone asked, can you tell us about participation in issues like Black Lives Matter as a 501c3? So we've gotten this question quite a bit recently, and it's a great question. And I think there is sometimes confusion around what is considered a political campaign activity and what is considered lobbying, and then what is considered just education around poverty and justice issues. And so with respect to Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter isn't, at least yet, an issue that would give rise to some kind of political campaign activity restriction or problem at this point. So if there were any sort of issues related to your 501c3 status with respect to Black Lives Matter, that would really likely only arise if there was some type of legislation that was being introduced, enacted, passed, or if you were trying to introduce or enact legislation around Black Lives Matter issues, then in those sorts of scenarios, that would be considered lobbying. And as a 501c3 tax exempt organization, you can engage in what's referred to as an insubstantial amount of lobbying. Most likely, community action agency would never engage in enough lobbying to run afoul of that test, but it is a facts and circumstances test. So you always have to be careful, and you still need to track your time. And what's important to remember, just like with nonpartisan political activity, you can't use your federal funds to support activities, lobbying activities. And then, so trying to influence legislation, trying to pass legislation. So I guess the one scenario that a Black Lives Matter issue could kind of run afoul of the political campaign activity prohibitions, and this is talked about in that revenue ruling that Caroline mentioned, is if there was a piece of legislation that around Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Matter as a policy matter, that movement is tied so closely to a political campaign that you can't really separate that policy from that candidate. And there are other factors that you would consider, such as timing of when that campaign is happening, sort of the work you've been doing on this issue maybe prior to the close tie between that campaign and that issue. Then there is a chance that involvement could be seen as supporting that candidate. However, the IRS revenue ruling really lays out nicely sort of ways in which you can, and maybe Debbie is going to talk more about this, but ways in which you can engage in sort of these policy matters that do not run afoul of these political campaign activity restrictions if for some reason that policy was so closely tied to a political campaign. So that's just sort of a quick overshot of how that could potentially become an issue. But at this point, I don't really see that as a political campaign issue. It says, what about CSBG staff notarizing mail-in ballots as part of their services? And if their notary services are offered for other services as well, is this considered nonpartisan political activity and prohibited? So if it's nonpartisan political activity, it wouldn't be prohibited by the 501c3 rules. It really depends on how you're funding that activity. So nonpartisan activity may not be performed in such a way that a CSBG program could be identified with that activity. So I would want someone to step back and think about, you know, how are we conducting this activity, and are we conducting it in such a way that it cannot be identified, connected to, associated with our CSBG program. And there are ways that you can do that, but sometimes that takes sort of a kind of finer analysis. And we at CAPLAW are happy to walk through that analysis with someone if that would be helpful to them. With respect to the activity, as long as these types of activities are engaged in a nonpartisan manner, so I would think in this instance, the notary services would have to be available to any low-income client or any client that you might be serving. There would be no discussion, mention of who they're voting for, what the ballot says, anything, what the ballot says in a partisan or in a partisan way, so you're not trying to influence the ballot or how they respond to the ballot. So there are ways to conduct these activities to ensure that you're doing so in a nonpartisan manner so you don't run afoul of the 501c3 rules. So here it says, does that mean that the League of Women Voters could come to our Head Start site and hold voter registration efforts, say at pickup time if COVID ever ends, or they could be outside and handing out registration forms with their phone numbers for assistance? That's a great question. I'm going to hold on that question because that question just might be a part of our hypothetical, but we'll wait and see. Can CAAs serve as polling locations on election day? That is a much more difficult question. I actually don't know the answer to that right off the top of my head. you know, you do have to be cognizant of the fact that you always have to use your federal funding to further, and your grant funding for that matter, state, to further those grant purposes. So this could be a possibility if you have a facility or a building that the funding that supports or pays for that facility or building, and the resources that are used in that building are ones that would enable you to conduct this type of activity, and you did so in a nonpartisan manner. So I'll just throw that out there. Oh, please make the slide deck available. Well, I think we will. That's a great question. Okay, so I think that's all the questions in the chat box. So Caroline, I'll turn it over to you to start us off, and we can walk through our hypothetical together.
Great, thanks, Allison. So our hypothetical today is about Poly Politico and Community Action Agency, also known as CAA. CAA is a nonprofit that runs a number of programs, including weatherization and Head Start. And CAA uses its CSBG funds for case management services, community needs assessment and planning, and a portion of indirect costs for central management, including the executive director. So let's say that Poly Politico, a longtime chairperson of CAA's board, is passionate about her community and raising the voice of those individuals and families served by the CAA. She has served CAA well and was responsible for hiring the current executive director, Eddie Dare. Lindsay, you can go ahead to the next slide. So we have a couple different scenarios that we wanted to flag for you all today before we turn it over to Debbie. First of all, let's say Poly believes that CAA should take steps to ensure that its clients are educated on the poverty and racial equity issues that impact them. Poly asks Eddie Dare, the executive director, if CAA would consider engaging in the following activities in furtherance of these efforts. So our first hypo is, you could click the next one. Yep. Could CAA run a telephone bank reaching out to clients to discuss poverty and racial equity issues and giving them information about candidates to address these issues? So take a second, think to yourself about whether you think this would be permitted under, again, we run down the list: IRS rules, 501c3 rules, grant rules, uniform guidance, and then finally administrative guidance or other guidance from a funding source. So when it comes to 501c3 rules, the first one that we check, if we think about the different scenarios that are addressed in that IRS revenue ruling, it seems that under these particular circumstances, the answer would probably be no, because educating, giving information only about the certain candidates that address poverty and racial equity issues in a way that corresponds to how these clients are leaning about them would be a partisan way of educating those voters about the choices in an upcoming election. So there's two basic types of voter education here. There's education about the process of voting, you know, how to get information about where your polling place is, helping people vote early, or making a statement about how important voting is. And there are also ways to provide ballot information about policies that are being addressed by the candidates in a given election. And in this case, you know, you could create a nonpartisan voting guide, or put together a candidate questionnaire in a nonpartisan way to educate the folks you're reaching out to on a broader level about the many different issues that the candidates are addressing, but by slanting your education to only candidates who address certain issues, you're actually kind of leaving the rest of them out, which results in a partisan slant to that activity. So under the IRS rules, the answer to number one would be no. So moving on to number two, could CAA invite candidates who address these issues to speak at CAA's monthly community meetings? So again, we think about IRS rules, grant rules, uniform guidance, administrative guidance, and other funding source rules. Under the IRS rules, would this be a political campaign intervention in a partisan way? Not necessarily. And so the answer to this question number two is maybe. If the monthly community meetings and the platform that the CAA is giving to political candidates is given and is conducted in a nonpartisan manner, then it would likely be permissible under IRS rules. And there's nothing in the Uniform Guidance or Head Start Act or CSBG Act that says that you can't have a political candidate speak at an event that is that's funded. I think you can. Yeah, you can.
Well, you'd want to be careful, right? No, you'd want to be careful that if the candidate is coming just to talk about, so there's sort of a couple of scenarios with respect to inviting candidates. There's one in which you're inviting them as part of the campaign, and so and they're being a candidate in a campaign. And so if you're going to do that, you have to make sure that, as Caroline said, you do it in a nonpartisan way. And so you would invite all the candidates. You would make sure that they each had the same amount of time to speak, that they were speaking at the same time of day, that you're not inviting those candidates who your organization favors to speak at the time when most of the employees would be present, or most of the community would participate, versus times of day when only 10 people are showing up. So 8 in the morning versus 3 in the afternoon. So you want to be consistent in those invitations. And if you're going to do it in a forum style where they're all invited on like the stage together, you would want an objective third party to be asking the questions, and the questions should be developed by objective third parties that aren't going to ask unbiased or slanted questions, but ones that are the same for all candidates. So there are ways to do this. The reason it says maybe is because you still have to keep in mind those grant rules and the fact that the CSBG Act and the Head Start Act don't allow you to use their money or the CSBG to identify their program with nonpartisan political activities. So you want to make sure that this forum is done at a location in a way with resources that you are committed to use to support it, and that don't jeopardize your federal funding. A lot of times in situations like this, a community action agency will partner with another organization so that community action agency can be involved in helping to establish this activity, but isn't so bound in the way in which it is run or established by the restrictions that the community action agency has to comply with. There is also a scenario where you could just invite a political candidate to come to your location to talk about issues that they are experts on or knowledgeable on, and that are relevant to your organization that don't have anything to do with the campaign. The closer you get to an election, those types of invitations may look a little bit more suspicious, or be a little bit more difficult to sort of maintain a nonpartisan nature to them. But the IRS Revenue Ruling does talk about the ability of organizations to do that. And in that sense, that they are talking about issues that are relevant to your funding that you receive, and they wouldn't leave it to
around, you know, around the restrictions in the act. But we do have to make sure that it's clear that, you know, if they were prior to becoming a politician, an expert in, you know, nutrition, that they're coming to speak about nutrition and they're not going to be talking about their
Okay, thanks, Allison.
Yeah, no problem.
So moving on to our final two questions. So let's say that Polly decides to run for state senate, which is a partisan campaign. She's running on the American Party ticket, and she asks Eddie for a few favors on behalf of the CAA. The first thing she asks is whether Eddie could briefly mention Polly's campaign at the weekly staff meeting that he runs and encourage staff to register to vote. Think about that for just a second, and it should be setting off a Hatch Act alarm bell in your mind, since Eddie is paid partially from CSBG funds, and his salary is paid by the CAA, obviously, and he works in connection with all programs, including CSBG and Head Start. He would be considered what Allison called a hatched employee. With both Category 1 and Category 2 of hatched employees cannot use their official position to influence election results. And if Eddie were to encourage staff, his employees, to vote at a staff meeting, and if you were to mention that in connection with mentioning Polly's campaign, it would be reasonable to assume that given his authority over the whole organization, this could be seen as using his position to try to influence the election in Polly's favor. And so that would be a no on number 3. And then finally, our fourth question is, could DARE, and this is, you know, getting back to exactly the question received in the comments, could Eddie invite the League of Women Voters to conduct a voter registration drive at one of CAA's different sites in the weeks leading up to the election? The answer to this question is yes. This is an example of that carve out under the Head Start Act that allows nonpartisan organizations to run voter registration drives at Head Start facilities during their operating hours, so long as Head Start funds are not used for that drive. And so as long as all of the registration was conducted by the League of Women Voters and no Head Start funds were used, that would likely be permissible. But you should think again, you know, is there any chance that my CSBG funding could be associated with the voter registration drive that is being conducted at my Head Start site? So is CSBG used to pay for part of any of that facility, et cetera, et cetera. So before we turn it over to Debbie, if you go to the next slide, you can see there are some great resources available on our website at CAPLAW.org. And also there is a wonderful website called BoulderAdvocacy.org, which contains a number of different resources for 501c3 organizations related to lobbying and political activity and how to remain in compliance with 501c3 rules while engaging your clients in civic matters. So I think we got one more question, it looks like, or maybe a couple more. I don't know if we want to move on and then come back to those.
I think we should move on and let Debbie get through her slides, and then we'll answer questions at the end.
Okay. Over to you, Debbie. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Am I unmuted? Oops.
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks very, very much. That was all very interesting. And I think some of the questions that came up are going to continue to come up as I get through this, but thanks for the work that you're all interested in doing on this. We love partnering with community action. So you can go next slide. So there are a lot of ideas here. Voter registration and updating voter registration. You've already seen there are specific limitations on community action agencies. So you know, you have to recognize what you just heard in terms of what those limitations are. You have heard that if you can you know, invite a nonpartisan group like the League of Women Voters to a Head Start facility, to use that example, that's something you can do. But the key element here is that there are very handy resources to help direct people to totally nonpartisan sites that will help them register online, for instance, see whether they are registered online, that tell them what deadlines are for doing that. Those things are all available. The question for us is, how do you connect people to those resources in a way that doesn't run afoul of the restrictions that you've just been hearing about? That the key element here is, can you reach out beyond your own staff, obviously, to customers, community, to help people find out about what they need to do in order to vote. And there are a lot of good tools for this. So thanks, you can go on the next slide. So here are a number of websites that have very useful information. So you can see Nonprofit Vote. It is geared to provide information for nonprofits, so it doesn't run afoul of any of the earliest part of the presentation you just heard, but it isn't geared totally to deal with the restrictions that some community action agencies have. So it does, you know, this is a clickable set of websites, so you can go and see them yourselves. Vote 411 is extremely useful because it gives state by state information, helps you get registered. Vote.org also can help in that regard, and USA.gov/voting helps to get directed to your own Secretary of State or other election authority. So if you can go to the next slide. So I didn't want to go too long before talking about the COVID factor, which I'm sure is on everyone's mind. In fact, somebody had a question before, if it ever ends. Yeah, we all are there. So the complication here is, and I'm going to pose this as a question, not an answer, that of course we know you can use that example of make your site available for a nonpartisan voter registration drive to occur. But what if you're not going to sites? What if you're not setting up that kind of activity? What if you're trying to encourage as much by email, online information, texting information in order to get information out to people? You know, what are the answers there? And that is a question that I didn't add to the chat box, but I'll just say right out loud for our discussion later that you know, the CAPLAW speakers may want to weigh in on. One thing I would suggest is if there are, say, Head Start parents separate listservs or text groups, or if there are ways that they are communicating among themselves, that might be a particular area, not only Head Start, but any community-oriented email lists or other communications efforts that are the parents themselves or students or whatever the particular example is. If they're communicating amongst themselves, it might be a much easier way of putting out that information about, here's the website, click here, you can find out if you're registered to vote. Click here and you can register to vote, that sort of thing. So, that's a question. But here on this slide, you can see links to special voting information that's been done since COVID to keep you up to date on that. These are all links that you can go to. So these are resources that you'll have because you'll have the slides. You can go on to the next one. So on voter registration, you can move right along. So here too, this information is shows that there really is a lot of resources to help people go online and register. Your specific means of connecting people to that is the challenge that we're all facing here. So you can go on to the next one. So here are, these are two very helpful links because a lot of people are not going to be sure whether they're registered to vote. And that's particularly important in states where they tend to purge voter rolls, so that if someone hasn't voted for a while, they may think they're registered, but they're not. But the first link there, you can check your voter registration here, will tell people anywhere in the country whether they are registered. So that's very useful information for people to have. And then registering to vote, that gets you to the one of the websites that we mentioned just before. So what will that do? Depending on the rules of your state, in some cases you can register online directly, which is great. And therefore you can just go through all the procedures. You can see that very often a state will require either a number that's on a state ID or usually a driver's license. And if you don't either have a driver's license or a state ID, then you're going to have to fill out paper and do it in a different way. But if you have that, for many states, you can register online. If not, when you go to that, it will connect you to a form that you have to fill out and usually mail in. So it still expedites it, but unfortunately not every state allows you to just do it online. So slide. So voter education. This is where some of the other discussions had come up about voter engagement. Why should you vote? And of course, practical information about how you go about doing it. And I think in the general voting education area, just the practical information is where is your polling place. Whatever works in terms of meeting all the rules you've just been hearing about, in terms of informing people about that there is access to voter registration, or any of that information about mail-in voting, all of that kind of thing. you can supply that information. Here again, we have to think about what are the communication routes. And Lindsay is on, and she's like the champion outreach person on the census. And I do think that a lot of the strategies that are being employed now to reach people when you can't do the usual efforts of, sorry, a little distracted, where you can't do the usual in-person sessions. The census outreach has figured out ways of doing that. And I think we're going to have to learn from that and apply some of those same mechanisms, but telling people this kind of information, where's your polling place, when can you vote, if you want to vote by mail, how do you go about doing it? All of that is really important information to get out, and that I think veers on the less worrisome, acceptable range out of all the various activities that you've been hearing about. The why you should vote is a little different, you know, and in that, using the example that we just heard about a forum, say about, you know, race and economic justice issues or something like that, you should consider having that kind of forum and not making it a candidate forum, and simply raising issues that you could raise at any time, just to remind people that there are a lot of issues at stake, and not ask the candidates to come. Just leave it out there as a series, however you want to do it, of ways of communicating about, here are a lot of important issues in front of the country. And that might remind people that those issues are addressed by people who you get to select if you do vote, but you don't have to be the ones to make that connection. You can assume that just talking about the issues may make it matter to people. So anyway, you can go to the next slide. The why vote. The other part of that is messages about our country is a democracy, every voice should be heard. Again, that's comparable to the census work that you've been doing. You know, everyone should count, and every voice should be heard. That is a general message that's very separate from anything to do with one candidate or another. Information about the kinds of decisions that candidates make, officials make, would be something that can be part of your voter education as well. Telling people that the allowable kinds of lobbying that's done, you know, again, staying very within the confines. We're C3, we're very clearly in the confines of what we're allowed to do, but that elected officials sometimes pay attention to whether the people that are communicating with them are registered to vote, and they sometimes look it up. And so it would be useful to feel confident that those numbers get up. But of course, don't tell anybody who to vote for. I think that's coming through very clear here. Again, we've talked about the challenges of in-person voting, and I've talked already about mail-in voting. Well, I've talked about through voter registration. There certainly have been efforts to make it easier to vote by mail, and those are operating state by state. The various websites will tell you exactly what the rules are for your state, but the links that are on this page slide do show you how you can look up what your polling place would be if you're going in for the in-person voting, and what the either requesting an absentee or mail-in ballot through that, that will, if you go there based on the address you give, you'll see the rules that apply in your area. So again, those rules are changing, and in some states make it a lot harder than others, as I think you know, but more states are allowing a broader set of rules, or not asking any reasons why people seek an absentee ballot. So helping people to understand what the rules are in your area would go a long way to make it easier for people to vote with confidence and safety. So you can go to the next slide. So here too, this is just another set of information about finding your own polling place, finding out if there is early voting in your state. That's very common. So again, being able to provide people with the information about early voting it is quite important. And these are just links so that you can have what you need in order to convey that. Go to the next. Again, with voter education, this does seem like the kind of thing that you might want to team up with other organizations that have completely nonpartisan information about this, and maybe make available what other organizations might be supplying, so people can understand what's going to be in front of them. And we shouldn't dismiss that, because if people have not voted in the past, they're a little nervous about what's going to be in front of them, and just making it more familiar can help. So we can go to the next one, voter mobilization. Again, you've been told about limits to what you can do specifically in this area. And I think you need to, and I'm not going to answer all the questions as far as exactly what you can do, but the extent to which you can help people to know about the importance of voting in the most general way. Everybody says, ask people to make a plan how they'll vote. That's an important part of your voter education. That don't just say or encourage others to do this, bring in other people to do it. That part of the drill is on election day, how are you actually going to go about getting to the polls? Or is your plan to be an early voter, or is your plan to do a mail-in voting? Helping people to make that plan. There's a lot of evidence that that's the effective way of getting more people to carry it out. So you can go to the next slide. The spreading the word, that is the challenge. And the challenge is related to how we can do that communication most effectively. And we've been working in tandem with Community Action, Lindsay's efforts on the census. How do you get out the word about that when there are so many fewer opportunities to meet with people face to face? And I would say that we're all of us going to be reconnoitering to apply the lessons of those ways that you can reach out to people to the voter education efforts. There will be materials created by some of the organizations that I cited earlier, like Nonprofit Vote and others, that you can make use of. So I think that there's a lot that you can forward on from other groups that do not require you to come up with these things yourself, that could be on websites and all that kind of thing. As I said, toolkits will be coming soon, so there's a lot of material that will be available as soon as we get over this hump of the census, right? So let's see, I think the next slide is the plan, which we talked about, so keep going. And one of the issues that's very important is there's a lot of concern about potential voter suppression efforts. There is the voter protection hotline, which is there, and links to knowing your rights about voting. Part of the overall encouragement of participating in our democracy does need to be, unfortunately, telling people what their rights are and how they can be protected if there is a problem. And here too, you don't have to create these resources. They do exist, and there are links here to make sure that people understand. So you can go on. Right, this is what democracy looks like. You may have heard that. So we can all chant now. Wake everyone up. But operating within the very important advice of CAPLAW to find the mechanics for partnering with the groups that can deliver the message and provide the resources so that the people in your communities can exercise their rights. That is a really important challenge for us to work together to carry out. It's needed. There are models, as you've heard about, that in a non-COVID time have worked well for things like voter registration and voter education. Our challenge is to find those means of communication that don't require everybody sitting in a crowded room to do some of that same work. So there's my email address. I hope that you will work together to do as much of this as we can do. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I went a little crazy I'm a happy trigger finger. So Ryan and I only have a couple of slides and we're running a little long, which is fine. We wanted to let CAPLAW and the Coalition on Human Needs go through some stuff. As Deb mentioned, we will have some resources for folks and there will be more coming from the partnership. The flyer, for example, will be downloadable. We will also have materials that we can ship to, like we have been shipping census materials. I don't want to dwell on these. We have some prohibited activities that have all been discussed. We also have encouraged activities that have all been discussed. I just want to go straight to the webinar series that we have coming up. So we will be sending this PowerPoint out. You can click on these links to register for our August, September, and October webinars, our staff information, and then the next slide is questions. So Lauren, can you tell us what questions we have? Because I know that there are a bunch, while we have the CAPLAW and CHN expertise, that we would like them to address. So if you would read those out, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one was about posting information on the agency website, and specifically some of those links to Nonprofit Vote and other locations where you can go figure out if you're registered to vote or register to vote if you haven't yet.
So I think that's a question for CAPLAW, and I would also add social media postings to that question.
Yeah, it looks like there's a sort of multiple questions that are focused on that, and really the analysis is the same with respect to that activity. You know, first from a 501c3 perspective, you of course want to make sure that it's nonpartisan information that you're posting. I think that's been hit home, and as Debbie said, been probably pounded into everyone's head more so by everything we've said and what they probably heard elsewhere. So that's just always important to remember. I think the trickier part of it, which is what I think some of the questions are trying to get at, is you know, how that social media site is supported internally via a CSBG funded person, via a non-CSBG funded person, Head Start, WAP, etc. And so, you know, generally, you have to always be cognizant of that language that we went over in the Federal CSBG Act and in the Head Start Act, that you really can't use any CSBG funded or Head Start funded resources to support any nonpartisan activity that you may engage in. So while that activity is allowable, it's an allowable activity for you as a 501c3 to engage in, you have to think about how are we supporting that activity, engaging in that activity from a funding perspective. So, you know, the safest and most conservative approach, since CSBG has that language in it that could result in a broader application of the prohibition, that identification language, is to really, you know, have a Facebook page that isn't funded by CSBG funds or Head Start funds. Facebook is free, last I looked, so that shouldn't be too big of an issue. The real issue is, well, who is managing and maintaining that page? You know, there are all these kind of arguments you can kind of go through with respect to, well, this percentage of the person's salary is X and only this percentage is Y. The safest approach is just to use an employee who isn't funded by any CSBG money to perform that activity. With Head Start, because it is so closely tied to the Head Start, to the fact that that you are funded by Head Start, you could ostensibly maybe make an argument if there was an employee who was partially paid out of Head Start and partially paid out of some unrestricted or other money, that perhaps you were allocating that unrestricted time to that activity. I think, again, the safest approach is to use a non-CSBG, non-Head Start funded employee to manage that. You know, I do think with any sort of legal issue, there's always a risk assessment that's done by organizations with respect to compliance. We at CAPLAW have to encourage you to engage in as full compliance as possible. You as an organization can determine what level of risk you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with proceeding the way you're proceeding and taking on the risk that some cost could be disallowed because you were monitored and an employee who was being paid out of CSBG was engaged in a prohibited activity, that is a risk that you would have to assess. So that's sort of the impact of that. You're not going to run afoul of this penalty that that Caroline spoke to with respect to the 501c3 status, because that is not prohibited activity if it's nonpartisan information that you're posting. So it's really a question of a disallowed cost. And then again, you won't run afoul of the Hatch Act because you're not engaging in partisan or political campaign activity with respect to what you're doing with that posting. It's nonpartisan. So that's a quick kind of analysis of that. I think that might have been, is that your read, Lauren, of kind of the essence of sort of the last final questions here?
Yeah, I think you answered all three of them in one go.
You did a good job asking the
done.
question, Lauren. I think it was a team effort.
There we go.
We know when it's time to call it an end of the day.
And I guess I would just add that I do see a helpful suggestion of that's COVID related of no, you're not going to want to have an indoor voter registration session, but maybe outside the office where everybody's wearing their masks and they're socially distanced and all of that. And this is a question to Allison or Lauren, if it would have been okay to do that sort of activity with the invited guest, League of Women Voters or whoever it is, would that also be an okay activity to be doing outside as was described?
So I think with respect to that, yes, I mean, if you have a head start, if you're doing nonpartisan voter registration, you could do it in the parking lot of the Head Start site, on the sidewalk right in front of the Head Start site. And it is an excellent point because I know specifically here in Massachusetts, because of COVID-19, there are very strict requirements from the licensing agency, the child care licensing agency, so state level requirements as to who can go into a facility right now. It's very restricted. So it's not likely that you'll be able to set up your table inside or have a nonpartisan group set up a table inside. So definitely parking lot, sidewalk, outside of the Head Start facility, no problem.
I just want to congratulate, I'm sorry, I've lost the person who, Lee Dillon, I think, made that good suggestion. So lifting that up.
Thanks, Deb. Lauren, do we have more questions?
No, but I have a question myself. I was curious about if you are able to host an event where you invite all the candidates. Is it that it only matters that you invited them all, and if say one or two of them don't show up, are you covered as long as they were invited in the same manner?
Caroline, you can answer that. I see you're thinking.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lauren. Yeah, so this is why we would definitely encourage you, if you're going to have a candidate forum, to issue your invitations in writing, and then just keep a record of the invitations that you sent to each candidate. But if a candidate chooses to turn down your invitation, then you're not responsible for providing them with a forum, an equal forum, at that particular event or a future event. That's one of the scenarios that's addressed in the IRS Revenue Ruling, which again is 2007-41. And so you could take a look at that as well to get some more specifics about that particular scenario.
Right, and just to emphasize further, even though there is the acronym IRS associated and ruling associated with that document, it actually is a very user-friendly, accessible document, and it's not written in a legal way. It's really written in a way to help nonprofits understand, 501c3s understand the activities that they can engage in. And I'll also add to that Boulder Advocacy has a lot of great resources on how to conduct these activities in a nonpartisan way as well. That's sort of the legal arm. I think the Coalition on Human Needs probably has some resources as well on some of this stuff. Maybe. I see Debbie sort of.
Well, we're a C3, so we follow the rules. We follow Alliance for Justice,
Oh, great. Yeah.
you know, guidelines. We don't have the extra things that you are such an invaluable resource to help the CAP agencies understand the additional rules that they have to follow. But we're very dutiful about following the advice. Especially Alliance for Justice seems like it helps. But we have made use of the IRS ruling with the, and you're right, it is very in English.
So I have one more question that just came in, asking if the Head Start program classrooms are housed within the agency building, if the agency is able to host an event on site or in the parking lot with a nonpartisan group.
I'm not quite sure how that question, I'm sorry, differed from the other. So if our Head Start program or housed within our agency building. So I think this is getting at the fact that you also run other programs that aren't Head Start. It's not solely a Head Start facility. I think is what that question might be getting at. And I think, that is a trickier scenario. I think you would argue if there was ever any question by your other funding source, namely CSBG funding source, as to your holding nonpartisan voter registration activity outside of your building that houses your Head Start site. I think you would argue, look, this is attributed to our Head Start. This percentage of our building, our work is Head Start in this building, and under the Head Start rules, we can do this. While we can't divide up the sidewalk in a way that might make everyone happy, it's not realistic. The reality is Head Start allows us to do this activity, and so we're doing it. The cleanest and sort of easiest way would be, if there was a portion of the building that was, clearly Head Start, that Head Start parents only go in there and that sort of thing. That would be the best case scenario, just to set up the table there, and you would be in a better position to establish the pure Head Start nature of that activity. Not that you can use any Head Start money to fund any of it, or the resources, or the people, or the paper, pencils, whatever is being used. They have to bring everything on the site. I think due to COVID-19 and sort of the craziness that we're dealing with now, that likely you shouldn't face any issues with that.
Yes, thank you. We are coming up on the half hour, and I know that people have more questions, I'm sure, but we're going to leave it right now with our contact information. So you can reach out to any of us on the Community Action team for civic engagement. I'm sure that if we don't know the answers, we know where to find them. So that's the resource that I leave with you today. I know that a lot of this sounds like there's not a ton that you can do, but that's actually quite narrow. So yes, there are restrictions on things you can't do, but there are also things that you can do as long as you don't step afoul of those CSBG funding rules and that sort of a thing. So that's what we're trying to bring to you today. And I thank our panelists. We could not have done this without the three of you. So thank you so much for giving us your time today. We'll be pushing out more information. We will have materials for folks. And there's a little bit of talk that Ryan and I might be able to do some office hours for people to talk through questions. So stay tuned for that. And thank everyone for joining us. I really, really appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you. And just think creatively about civic engagement. Be creative. We're happy at CAPLAW to help you think through those creative thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Allison. We appreciate that. So thank you for joining us. We'll send out the notes and the PowerPoint and the recording, and we look forward to hearing from everyone. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.